Welcome to First But Last, brought to you by the Wyoming Humanities. I am your host, Emmy DeGrappa. Wyoming is called the Equality State because we were the first to give women the right to vote. 150 years later, we wonder what Wyoming women think about the progress toward equality now. Let's find out, and thank you for listening. Today, we are talking to Kayne Pyatt. She has been employed as a reporter for the Uinta County Herald. She's worked as an assistant professor of communication in Rock Springs. But most importantly, Kayne has been a lifetime advocate for women and human rights in a variety of careers and volunteer work. Welcome, Kayne.
Hi.
Where did you grow up?
Well, I was born in western Kansas, but my family moved around a lot because my father was in radio, and there's always a greener pasture somewhere else. And my family migrated to Wyoming in the 1950s. And I call Evanston my home because I've lived here longer than any other place.
Oh, okay. Well, since 1950, that is a long time.
Well, I, too, as an adult, have moved away and come back. It seems like no matter where I go, I always wander back to Wyoming. And I've lived in other towns in Wyoming and also other states. Lived in Iowa for 7 years and still came back to Wyoming.
So I have a couple of questions when I introduced you, and it really seemed that when I was reading your bio that your passion has been in your work as an advocate for women and human rights. And so the first thing I wanted to ask you is, who is your earliest female mentor or role model?
Well, I'd have to say my mother. My mother was very strong, quiet, not probably as social as I have always been, but a very strong woman and had been through a lot in her life and valued education and standing on your own 2 feet and that you could do anything if you really followed it and pursued it. So I'd have to say my mother. Even though as a small child, my dad was my hero and I followed him around. I remember when I was about 5 years old, standing at the screen door in our house, crying and crying and crying because my dad was leaving and going somewhere, and I wanted to go with him. And I'll never forget that because as I stood there on the screen door, I saw all these flies landing on the screen door, and my mother finally coming to get me and comforting me. But I used to follow my dad around when I was older, even when he sold ads for the radio station. And I admired the fact that it was so easy for him to communicate with people and with strangers. And my dad was 50 when I was born. He was born in 1892. And my mother was 23, 25 years younger than him. And so it was like I had these two different time eras growing up with, and almost two different value systems, really. But both of them believed in hard work and had a strong work ethic, and that was passed down to me and my sisters.
So, Kayne, tell me about your passion that you have for advocating for women and the work that you've done in that area.
Okay. Well, I think it started when I was in kindergarten. And having grown up on what we call Radio Ranch, my dad had gone into business and built his own radio with a partner radio station. And in front of that, we had our home, a ranch, and had horses. And so I grew up around horses and again, following my dad around. And when I was and so I wore jeans a lot, bib overalls and jeans with suspenders. And when I was in kindergarten, this was in Kansas back in the 40s. And I was told that I couldn't wear pants to school. I couldn't wear jeans to school. And also I was left-handed. And my mom and the teacher wanted to force me to be right-handed. And my mom went to the school and argued with the teacher. And I got to wear my jeans and I stayed left-handed. And I think that instilled in me this question of why, just because I'm a girl, do I have to wear dresses and can't wear jeans when my whole life on the ranch was riding horses and being outside, and riding a horse in a dress is just not very comfortable. So it instilled in me this desire, I think maybe unconsciously, that things weren't just quite right for girls and that I was going to change that. And so as I grew, I also grew up in a time with the Cinderella story, and life was supposed to, as a young girl and as a woman, you were to get married, have children, make your husband happy, and that was supposed to be the perfect life. And I think I was pretty naive. I grew up in a fairly traditional home. My dad went to work, my mom stayed home. And so partly what developed this passion about things weren't quite right and I wanted to change them had to do with a lot of experiences. Getting pregnant at 16 and married and having 4 children by the time I was 25. And
wow,
getting a divorce, and getting a divorce 10 years later, and not being able to buy a car without my dad's signature, finding that credit cards women just didn't get them a loan, women didn't get credit a loan, and facing those roadblocks made that desire to change things even stronger. And I remember as a teenager, because I was so involved with horses, that my dad was in the Sage Riders Mounted Posse, which was here in Evanston, and they would be in parades. And then if the sheriff's department needed to call out people for a search and rescue, that Mounted Posse went. And I thought it would be neat if there was a junior Mounted Posse, young people. So I organized it. I got friends that were horse people, boys and girls, and we had a meeting and we organized and we set up a sort of what we'd call today bylaws. And my dad took it to the Sheriff's Mounted Posse, and they agreed to sponsor us as the junior Mounted Posse, but a girl could not be president.
What?
Yes.
What?
And so I was just furious about that and hurt, because I had done all the work to organize it and get it set up and writing the bylaws. And so I dropped out. And early on in my life, that was a way that was our responses. It's like if you suffered sexual harassment of any kind or discrimination, you just kept your mouth shut and did something else. And so I dropped out of that. But that stayed with me forever. And I think I've come to think in my 77 years that there's a thread, a subconscious thread, or that leads us from childhood all through our life. And one day I sat down and was writing in my journal, and I wrote some things about how all the games and the dreams I had as a child, as an adult, subconsciously that I have experienced those, or in reality I've experienced those. So whether subconsciously or the universe or whatever you want to call it, I don't call it fate, but the universe was sort of offering these doors to me, and I would open them, but I see that connection. So for instance, as a child, my sisters and I used to play school a lot, and my younger sister said to me one time as an adult, she said, you used to make me so mad because you would never let me be the teacher. And I grew up to not consciously really planning it, but ended up going to college, getting a master's degree and teaching college. And I guess I'm a firm believer in positive affirmations. And sometimes those affirmations may come just like as a child, it was a dream, or the dream I used to read every Zane Grey book there was, and I was really fascinated with the West. And having moved here to Evanston when I was 12 years old, and then always having horses from the time I was 5 years old, I was riding horses. I was fascinated with the West and always thought it would have been wonderful to be a pioneer and be on a wagon train. Well, in 1990, I organized and led the Wyoming Centennial Wagon Train from Fort Casper to Cody. And And that wasn't conscious, it's sort of like those dreams that to write. I always wanted to be a writer. And as a child, my sisters and I would cut out pictures out of magazines and write stories about them. And I would pretend I was a reporter. And now I'm a reporter at 77. Oh, it's just amazing to me how wonderful the universe is. And a friend of mine once said, our own lives aren't any of our business, I guess. But in other words, kind of the universe has got these doors for us. And I guess it's our job to just become aware and open those doors. And so back to the women, I think all those things that I experienced in my youth, and then after a 10-year marriage with a husband who was unfaithful to me throughout that whole entire 10 years, getting a divorce, being a single mom. And I have to be honest, I, still believed in that Cinderella fairy tale, went through 4 marriages, 4 divorces, most of the time still feeling like a single mom, raising 4 kids, slowly began to lose that fantasy reality and realizing that nobody but me was ever going to change my life or make my life better. And so I went back to college, got my, with 4 kids, got my associate's degree, and then 10 years later, went back again and got my master's. When I got my bachelor's and then my master's, my oldest daughter, my son, and I were all in college together. And
I love that. I love that.
So some of the things I've done with women is when in my second marriage, I lived in Iowa for 7 years, and I had the opportunity to become a VISTA volunteer, a locally recruited VISTA volunteer, and worked with a sexual assault and domestic violence program, and later went on to become the director of that program. And that just, again, was that desire to make changes for women, and this was an opportunity to do that. And when I came back to Evanston after my divorce, I started the sexual assault and family violence program here in Evanston, and I had just a barely squeaked by job at that time, but spent all my other hours organizing that, and was involved in the League of Women Voters at one time. And then I started, when I came back here again, after getting my master's in Salt Lake City, I started doing women's retreats. And we would go to the mountains, camp out. It was wonderful. I think I've spent probably 10 years of my life doing those women's retreats, both privately and then when I taught at Western Wyoming College, I held women's retreats there, was involved in organizing the women's conferences, and then I had the wonderful opportunity to go to a goddess conference in England, and led by a wonderful woman who traveled all over the world gathering up she was an artist and created artistic flags of all the different goddesses across the world. And so from that, I became so interested in that. I wanted to teach the feminine mythology. And so I researched, self-taught, and developed a curriculum to teach that at Western. And I used to have waiting lists. I'd let 30 students into my class, and I used to have waiting lists to get into that class, both men and women. It was wonderful. It was a great experience. And saw young women really grow from learning about prehistory and pre-Christianity roots of when women had more power and equality. And
is that in the class that you were teaching feminism in mythology? Okay. And what was your spiritual upbringing?
Well, my spiritual upbringing as a child, my parents, Sunday was always church. And when we lived in Kansas, I think the church that they attended was called the First Christian Church. And then when we moved to Wyoming, there was no church, no denomination called that. So we joined the First American Baptist Church. And so I always grew up with religion, and I always felt like I was a spiritual person, but When I went back to college in Westminster College to get my degree, one of the first classes I taught, and actually I went back to college to get my bachelor's because I thought I wanted to be an Episcopal priest. And I took a archaeology class and an anthropology class and grew. And from that, I decided no. And throughout this whole growing process, I realized that traditional religion just wasn't for me. And I'm still a spiritual person, but I experienced that more in connection with the earth and with what some people call pagan, but pagan, really the definition of pagan means people of the earth. So I have my own sense of spiritual connection with the earth, with the universe. I guess I'd say it's more like Star Wars.
Star Wars.
Yeah, let the force be with you.
The force be with you. Okay.
Yeah.
And so through your journey and discovering, the pitfalls that are created for women and how they fall into them and how you fell into the Cinderella syndrome and then pulled yourself out of that. But, how have things changed over the years for women? How do you see that? And what do you see as positive that is happening?
Well, I think one positive thing that just comes quickly to my mind is how older women especially are given more voice. Not enough, but because I think there is age discrimination, but even Hollywood is recognizing the need for more movies, more productions that involve older women in strong positions. More and more women are getting into higher levels of political positions, though I don't think enough. And I have to tell you, I cried when Elizabeth Warren dropped out of the race because I want to live long enough to see a woman president. I lived long enough to see an African American president, but I want to see a woman president. And one thing I thought when Obama was elected was during the whole suffragist movement, in the split between the suffragists, because some wanted to include the right for women to vote with the 15th Amendment for African American men to get the right to vote, and that whole thing, African American men got the right to vote before white women or any woman. And I saw Obama being elected. Not only do I think he's an admirable person, but also as the catalyst for, okay, so we came second after them getting the right to vote. Now maybe we will be president now. So I think we're not there yet. I see mostly women working in restaurants and cafes in Wyoming, and I know that they're making less than minimum wage and they depend on their tips for survival. My heart goes out to them right now with this crisis that they're laid off, they're not working. I mean, thank heavens there's going to be some help from the federal government. But women, in many, many cases, their families depend on them. They are the breadwinners today. And so I think we've got a long way to go. I also get a little frustrated, even with my own granddaughters, that they just take for granted what they have today, and they don't seem to really want more or want to achieve more or want to strive for more. A lot of the young women I had in my feminine mythology class, I think I saw them grow, and I've seen them, and in fact, many I've come into contact with, because Wyoming is a small world, have really gone on to make themselves proud of where they've gone and the jobs and careers that they're moving into. But I get frustrated with the lack of knowledge that most young women have about where me and my foremothers came through to get them what they have today. So,
well, what can we do to change that? What can we do to mentor young women to open their eyes to what has gone before and the work that they need to do to keep it going?
Well, I think teachers are important for that. I felt like I was doing that when I was teaching at the college, because I taught communication classes as well. And I often think that whatever course we're teaching, it's a vehicle for what other things we can teach. And so I think role modeling, actually giving them information that they're not getting. And on the suffragette movement, what we did here in Evanston is that we had an event. We organized a group, a 19th Amendment committee, and all through the last year, we had an event every month. And one of them in June was a parade. And we actually had 4 little girls under teen years. They were like 10, 11, 12 who joined us in that parade. And I think just that modeling and that getting the education out to them. I'm thrilled today to see more and more children's books on famous women and on the suffragette movement and on the civil rights movement and on women who made a difference in the past. So I think writers, teachers, women who are in politics who can mentor and role model for young girls, take them with them. Let them spend a day or two in the legislature with them, watching it. Sometimes I feel really hopeless. And then somebody like Greta Thunberg will come along and my heart just swells at what young people are doing regarding climate change. And so it's a slow process.
Change is always slow.
Yes, it is.
But I'm glad that you've had these rich experiences, not just for yourself, but also teaching class and influencing other young women and helping them, see that they have their own power.
I love it. And I'd like to add, too, that I'm a director and on the board of our community theater here, Sagebrush Theater. And one of the things that I try to do is influence the board to pick plays that aren't just silly and aren't just always comedy, but have a message and that involve young people, and to get more young people involved and put them on the board and try to get more and more young women to get involved in the arts. I think that's a way where they begin to explore. Once you're involved in the arts, I truly believe in a liberal arts education. And I think through a liberal arts education, you're exposed to so many different ideas, so many different thoughts and ways of living that it can't help but have an influence on young people.
Well, since I work for the Wyoming Humanities, I could not agree more. That's so true. I 100% agree with that. But thank you so much, Kayne. Thank you for talking to me today.
I really enjoyed it. Thanks, Emmy.
Thank you for listening to First But Last, brought to you by the Wyoming Humanities. Please join us again next week as we continue our conversations with women from around the state. You can also find us at thinkwy.org, where we continue the conversation on our blog about the history, journey, and the challenges of Wyoming's intrepid women living in the equality state. And if you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the show and leave us a review on iTunes. Thank you for listening.